Drink it, sweetheart. It'll help with the headaches." My aunt slid the mug across the granite countertop with both hands, the way you offer something precious to someone you love. She didn't know I'd been standing in the hallway for 4 minutes before I walked in. She didn't know I'd watched her open the child-proof cap on a bottle of my late grandmother's warfarin, tap out 6 small pills onto the cutting board, and grind them into the chamomile with the back of a spoon. She didn't know any of that. But I knew everything. I didn't throw the mug. I didn't run. I just looked at the pale yellow tea, then looked across the kitchen at my cousin Brianna, who was scrolling on her phone and eyeing my drink the way she always eyed anything that looked like it might be better than hers. I picked up the mug. I smiled. And before I tell you what happened next, I need you to drop a comment right now and tell me, what is the one thing your family did to you that you stayed silent about for way too long? I'll read every single one. Because I spent 28 years being silent and I know exactly what that costs. You want to understand how I got here. Standing in my aunt's kitchen holding a mug of tea spiked with blood thinners, you need to understand what kind of family I come from. My grandmother, Rose, owned a house in Oakville, Ontario. 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, a backyard that backed onto a conservation trail. She'd bought it in 1987 with my late grandfather for $240,000. By the time she died last March, it was worth just over $1.4 million. That's what we're really talking about. That's what this whole story is about. Not love, not grief, not family. $1.4 million, and who gets to keep it? My grandmother had 2 children. My mother, Diane, who died of ovarian cancer when I was 9. And my aunt, Patricia, who has been alive and very well and spending money she doesn't have for my entire life. When my mother died, my grandmother took me in without hesitation. She drove me to school in her Subaru every single morning for 9 years. She showed up to every one of my university convocations in Waterloo with flowers she'd cut from her own garden. She taught me how to make butter tarts and how to read a lease agreement and how to stand up straight when someone was trying to make you feel small. Patricia never did any of those things. Patricia called it Christmas if she remembered. Patricia sent birthday cards that arrived 4 days late with the wrong age written inside. Patricia lived 40 minutes away in Mississauga, in a house that had been quietly going underwater for years because her husband Marcus had a talent for making money disappear. Renovation projects that never finished, car leases he couldn't afford, a business that lasted 11 months and left behind $40,000 in unpaid supplier invoices. When my grandmother got her diagnosis, stage 3 kidney disease, managed but progressive, Patricia suddenly appeared. Every Sunday, flowers. Every Tuesday, a casserole. Every phone call from my grandmother's landline had Patricia's voice humming in the background. I noticed. I always noticed. I just told myself I was being uncharitable. Grandmother noticed too, I think, because 8 months before she died, she called me into her living room, sat me down on the floral sofa she'd had since before I was born, and told me she'd updated her will. She was leaving the house to me. She said she'd talked to her lawyer, a man named Gerald Fitch, whose office was on Kerr Street, and that everything was in order. She said she wanted me to have it because I was the one who had actually shown up. Not because Patricia hadn't tried, she said carefully, but because there is a difference between trying and being there, and I had been there. I thanked her and I cried a little and I told her I didn't need a house. I just needed her. She patted my hand. She said, "I know. That's why it's yours." She died in October, peacefully, in the Oakville Trafalgar Memorial Hospital, with me on one side and Patricia on the other. The reading of the will was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral at Gerald Fitch's office. Patricia arrived with Marcus and Brianna, which I thought was strange because you don't normally bring your entire family to a will reading unless you're expecting something large. They dressed up. Patricia wore a blazer. Marcus had shaved. Gerald read the Weezer. Marcus had shaved. Gerald read the will. The house went to me. Patricia's expression didn't change, not one muscle. She just nodded slowly, like she was absorbing a mild inconvenience. I remember thinking, she already knew. She had been told before, or she had figured it out, and she was not surprised. She was performing composure. What I didn't understand yet was that she wasn't composing herself for the grief. She was composing herself for the plan. It started small. A week after the reading, Patricia called and asked if she could go through some of my grandmother's things. Sentimental items, she said. Some jewelry that had belonged to her mother before Rose. I said, of course. We scheduled a Saturday. She brought Brianna. They were there for 3 hours. I made coffee and let them move through the house and tried not to feel like I was watching something be slowly disassembled. Brianna asked, very casually, whether I had thought about what I was going to do with the property. I said I hadn't decided. She said the market in Oakville was very competitive right now. She said her friend's parents had sold the place 2 streets over for almost 1.6. She said it almost like a compliment. Then, also casually, she said, it's a lot for one person to manage, especially if you're on a nurse's salary. I let it go. I shouldn't have. Over the next 2 months, the pressure became less casual. Patricia called twice about the property taxes. Had I looked into what the annual bill would be? Had I considered that the furnace was probably original and would need replacing within the year? Had I thought about how complicated the estate transfer process was, and wouldn't it be easier to just sell now while the market was good and split the proceeds like a normal family? I told her the will was clear. The house was mine. There was nothing to split. She told me she just wanted what was fair. I told her the will represented what our grandmother thought was fair. She went quiet for a moment and then said, very softly, your mother would have wanted this handled differently. I hung up. I told myself I would give it space. Grief does strange things to people. Patricia had lost her mother. Maybe the entitlement was just pain, wearing an ugly coat. Then, 6 weeks ago, I got a call from Gerald Fitch. He was calling to inform me, with some discomfort in his voice, that he had received a letter from a lawyer representing Patricia, contesting the validity of the will on the grounds that our grandmother had been suffering from diminished cognitive capacity at the time of signing. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I called Gerald back when I could speak properly. He told me that the claim had very little legal merit. He had documented notes from the signing, a witness, and my grandmother had been fully lucid and unequivocal in her instructions. But he said these challenges could take time. They could cost money. And sometimes, he said carefully, that was the point. I drove to my grandmother's house that night. I sat in her kitchen in the dark for a long time. I thought about the woman who had raised me, the woman who had shown up when everyone else hadn't. And I thought about the fact that the legal challenge was going to cost me money I had saved very carefully over 4 years of night shifts and overtime, and that Patricia probably knew that. That was the math. Drained me until I gave up and sold. I didn't sleep much that night, but when I did, I made a decision. I was not going to fight them the way they wanted me to fight. Expensive, slow, on their terms, in their timeline. I was going to give them exactly enough rope to do what greedy people always eventually do with rope. Patricia had called twice that week asking if I wanted to talk things through over tea. I had not responded. But the following Monday, I called her back and said yes. I arrived at her house in Mississauga on a Wednesday evening. I brought nothing except my phone, which I slipped into the front pocket of my cardigan with the screen locked, but the voice memo app running. Patricia made chamomile tea. We sat at her kitchen table. Marcus was there, hovering near the counter in a way that felt staged. Brianna appeared from the hallway and sat down without being invited, which I had expected. Patricia talked for 40 minutes. I let her. She talked about fairness and family legacy and what Rose would have really wanted. She talked about Marcus's back problems and Brianna's student loans. She talked about how she had spent her own savings flying back and forth to be with Rose in her final months. Then she made her offer. She said, we'll drop the legal challenge. In exchange, you sign the property over to the estate, and we split the sale proceeds, 60-40. 60 to you, 40 to us. That's generous given everything. I asked her what everything meant. She said, given that there's a reasonable question about whether Mom was herself when she signed. I said I needed to think about it. She said she understood. She topped up my tea with such warmth, such practiced warmth. And then she touched my hand across the table and told me she just wanted us to be a family again. I drove home. I replayed the recording twice. I saved it to 2 locations. But that wasn't the part that changed everything. What changed everything happened 3 weeks later. I was at the house in Oakville going through the last of my grandmother's files. Financial records, old insurance documents, the kind of paperwork that accumulates over a lifetime. I was in the second bedroom she had used as a study, pulling folders from the bottom drawer of her old filing cabinet. Behind the folders, taped to the back wall of the drawer, was an envelope. Inside the envelope was a document I didn't recognize at first. It was a life insurance policy. The insured was me. The policy value was $400,000. The coverage type was listed as accidental death and serious injury. The signature at the bottom was not mine. I recognized the pen pressure, the slightly backward lean of the letters. My grandmother had always said Patricia wrote like she was trying to press through to the next page. The beneficiary listed was Patricia Ann Hollis. I stood in that room for a very long time. I thought about the phone call from the loan shark I'd overheard Marcus take in the driveway 2 Christmases ago, the one I told myself I hadn't heard properly. I thought about Brianna's comment about my nurse's salary. I thought about the legal challenge designed to exhaust me financially. I thought about Patricia's offer, 60-40, generous. Except, if I died accidentally before signing anything, Patricia collected $400,000 on a fraudulent policy, and the legal challenge over the house would continue against an estate with no one fighting it. Marcus's debt problems would be significantly reduced, Brianna's student loans manageable. The house, eventually, theirs. I set the envelope down very carefully. I did not call the police. Not yet. Because here is what I had learned from 28 years of watching my grandmother handle difficult people. You don't confront someone who is planning something. You wait until the plan is already in motion. A plan that hasn't happened yet is just a suspicion. A plan that is happening is evidence. I took photographs of every page of the policy with my phone. I emailed them to myself and to a secondary account I created that afternoon. I put the original back in the envelope and taped it to the back of the drawer exactly as I had found it. Then I called my cousin Brianna. Not Patricia. Brianna. I told her I'd been thinking about the offer. I said I was willing to talk again. I said I was feeling overwhelmed managing the house on my own, and maybe they were right, that it was too much. I let my voice sound a little tired. I let it sound like someone approaching a decision. Brianna told me she talked to her mother. Patricia called me that same evening. Her voice was warm. She said she was so glad I was coming around. She said she knew this had been hard, and she wanted us to move forward together. She asked if I wanted to come for dinner that Friday. Just family? She said. Nothing formal. I said I'd love that. I spent Thursday at a Best Buy in Burlington, not the one near my apartment. I bought a small Bluetooth speaker, the kind that sits on a kitchen counter and looks entirely ordinary, that had been modified with a 1080p wide-angle camera lens embedded in the front panel. I paid cash. I texted Patricia and asked if it was all right if I brought something for the kitchen. A little housewarming gesture, I said. She said, of course. How thoughtful. I arrived at her Mississauga house at 6:30 on Friday. I set the speaker on the counter near the kettle, connected it to her Wi-Fi while she was in the living room talking to Marcus, and showed her the app on my phone so she could control the music. She said she loved it. Then I excused myself to use the restroom. In the hallway bathroom, I opened the secondary app, not the music one, and confirmed the feed was live. The kitchen was clear and bright. I could see the entire counter, the table, the entrance to the living room. I washed my hands and went back to dinner. We ate pasta. Patricia had cooked from scratch. The conversation was careful, looping around the topic we were all there to discuss without quite landing on it. Marcus talked about a renovation project in Etobicoke. Brianna talked about a promotion she was up for at work. I asked questions and listened and let them feel like the evening was going the way they wanted. After dinner, Patricia made tea. I watched her move to the kettle from across the table. I watched her reach into the drawer beside the stove, the one I had specifically noted the location of when I arrived, because it was slightly open and I could see the orange prescription bottle inside. My grandmother's warfarin, the bottle Patricia had told me she disposed of when she helped clean out the house 2 months ago. I watched her. Under the table, my hand pressed flat on my thigh, very still. She tapped out 3, 4, 5, 6 pills onto the wooden cutting board, angled away from the table, angled away from Brianna, who was still on her phone. She crushed them with the flat bottom of a glass. Small, methodical movements, the kind you make when you've thought about doing something long enough that the thinking has become routine. Marcus was in the living room. I could hear the television. I could hear him change the channel. He did not come into the kitchen. Patricia swept the powder into the chamomile with her thumb. She poured the water from the kettle. She brought the mug to the table with both hands, set it in front of me, and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as love. Practiced, careful love. Drink it, sweetheart. It'll help with the headaches. I looked at the mug. Then I looked at Brianna. Brianna had put down her phone. She was looking at the mug too. But not the way someone looks at something dangerous. The way she looked at it was the way she had always looked at anything of mine, like she was calculating whether she wanted it more than I did. I wrapped both hands around the mug. I let the warmth seep into my palms. I inhaled slowly, loud enough to be theatrical, and said, "Oh, Patricia, did you use that lavender honey from the organic market on King Street? The one in the little jar with the cork lid?" Patricia blinked. "What? It smells exactly like it. I've been meaning to try it for months. It's like $20 for a small jar." I turned to Brianna. "Doesn't it smell expensive?" Brianna's nostrils flared. She leaned slightly toward the mug on the table, almost involuntarily. "It does, actually. Is that the one with the vanilla?" "I think so," I said, pulling the mug very slightly closer to myself. A small move. Almost unconscious looking. Brianna looked at her mother. "You didn't make me any?" Patricia's voice came out too fast. "It's for guests, Brianna. I'm not a guest in my own house." She reached across the table with the easy, automatic reach of someone who had grown up taking things without asking. "Let me smell it properly." I tightened both hands around the mug. "Bri, get your own." Mom literally just said, "It's for guests, not you specifically." Her fingers closed around the handle. "I just want a sip." Patricia said very sharply, "Brianna, leave it." We both looked at her. The sharpness was wrong. Too fast, too hard. It didn't match the warmth of the evening. Brianna heard it too. I could see the brief flash of confusion cross her face, but she was already committed to winning a petty argument, and that impulse overtook the confusion. "It's one sip, Mum." She pulled the mug across the table with both hands. "You're being so weird about a tea." Patricia's chair scraped back. She reached across. "Brianna, I mean it. Do not." Brianna drank. Not a sip. A long, deliberate swallow, eyes locked on her mother over the rim, performing the particular defiance of a 24-year-old who has always gotten her way and cannot conceive of a universe in which that stops being true. Patricia made a sound I will never forget. Not a scream, something smaller than a scream. A sound like something tearing very slowly. Marcus came in from the living room. "What's going on?" Nobody answered him. I was already standing, not because I was frightened, because I had practiced this moment in my head many times on the drive over, and I knew exactly what the next 4 minutes needed to look like. "How much did she drink?" I said, looking at Patricia. Patricia was frozen. Her face had gone through 7 expressions in 3 seconds and landed somewhere past fear, somewhere I didn't have a word for. "Patricia." I used my nurse voice. The one that cuts through panic in a hospital room at 2 a.m. "How much warfarin was in that mug?" The word landed. Brianna lowered the mug. She looked at her mother. She looked at the mug. Something shifted behind her eyes, not understanding yet. Just the beginning of it, the edge of a very cold and very large thing. "What did you put in her tea?" Marcus asked, very quietly. "It was for stress," Patricia said. Her voice had lost all its shape. It was nothing. It was herbal." "The warfarin from Grand's medicine cabinet," I said. "The bottle you told me you threw away." Patricia started to cry. It was immediate, overwhelming. The crying of a person whose plan has just arrived at a destination they somehow did not fully imagine until this moment. Brianna set the mug down on the table with a careful, deliberate click. She looked at me. Her face was completely still. "That was meant for you." It wasn't a question. Marcus sat down heavily in a chair. He said nothing. "I need to know exactly how much," I said to Patricia, "right now, because anticoagulants take time to cause damage, and we have a narrow window to intervene, and I need to know what I'm working with." Patricia told me. Her voice was barely a thread. She told me the number of pills. She told me there were 5-milligram tablets. I called 911. I gave them the address, the substance, the dosage, the time of ingestion. I told them it was an accidental ingestion, which was what I needed the call to record, because the word accidental keeps paramedics from slowing down to ask questions that would cost time. Then I opened the camera app on my secondary phone. Not the speaker feed. I had the speaker feed recording to cloud storage, and it would continue to do so, but a separate screen recording I'd been running since before I arrived, a backup that captured my own screen, including the live feed timestamps. I walked to Patricia. I held the screen 6 inches from her face. She watched herself open the prescription bottle. She watched herself count the pills. She watched herself grind them methodically into powder while Marcus changed channels in the next room. She stopped crying. She went very still instead, which was worse. "There are 2 files," I said. One is everything you just watched. The other is a voice recording from the dinner 3 weeks ago where you offered to drop a fraudulent legal challenge in exchange for property that is legally mine. I also found the insurance policy, Patricia, the one with my name and your signature and your beneficiary designation. I photographed every page. Marcus stood up. I think he was going to say something. He looked at Patricia instead. He looked at her for a long time. Then he sat back down. The sirens started outside. Brianna had not moved or spoken since she set down the mug. The paramedics came through the front door I had left unlocked when I arrived. They worked on Brianna quickly, efficiently. Vitamin K protocol, activated charcoal, IV line, monitor. I gave them her weight, her age, the exact compound, the dosage, the ingestion time, all of it in the flat professional language of someone who has done medical handoffs 1,000 times because I have. One of the paramedics looked at me as they were preparing to move Brianna and said, "You're a nurse?" "Yes," I said. He nodded. "She's lucky you were here." 2 constables from Peel Regional Police had come in behind the paramedics. I excused myself from the kitchen and introduced myself to the officer near the hallway. I was calm. I had been calm for 3 hours. I explained that I was the individual who had been targeted, that an ingestion had occurred involving a third party, and that I had documentation relevant to a fraud and attempted homicide investigation. I gave him the insurance policy photographs. I gave him the voice recording. I gave him the cloud storage link to the speaker camera footage. He looked at his partner. His partner looked at Patricia. Brianna was taken to Trillium Health Partners in Mississauga. She spent 9 days there. Warfarin toxicity at that dosage, in a young woman of her size, is survivable with fast treatment. And the treatment was fast because I made sure of it. On the 2nd day of her hospital stay, I went to visit her. I didn't know what I expected. I don't know what she expected either. She was sitting up in the bed looking out the window at the parking structure, and she didn't say anything when I came in. And I didn't say anything for a while either. Then she said, "How long did you know?" I said, "About the policy?" 3 weeks. About what they were capable of. Longer than that, I think. I just didn't want to know. She was quiet for a minute. Then she said, "She really did it." Not to me. More to the window. "Yes," I said. "For the house. For the house. And the policy payout. And probably for Marcus's debt." I think it had been a plan for a long time. Long enough to get the policy written. Long enough to let the legal challenge drag until my savings were low. I paused. I think she thought I was like her. That I was transactional. That I had stayed in Grandma's house for the money, and if she threatened that money, I'd either sell or become easy to remove. Brianna turned away from the window and looked at me directly for the first time. She looked exhausted. She looked younger than 24. What did Gran see in you? Actually, what was the difference? I thought about it honestly before I answered. "She showed up for me when I was 9 years old and nobody asked her to," I said. "That's not transactional. That's just love. And I showed up back. I think that's actually the whole story." Brianna pressed her lips together. She looked back at the window. The charges came through over the following weeks. Administering a noxious substance with intent to endanger life under Section 245 of the Criminal Code. Fraud over $5,000 for the forged insurance policy. The charge on the insurance policy alone carries up to 14 years. Patricia's lawyer entered a not guilty plea, which meant the recordings, the document photographs, and my testimony were going to be required at trial. Patricia called me once from the remand center. I didn't answer. Marcus called me twice. I didn't answer those either. Gerald Fitch, my grandmother's lawyer, told me with some satisfaction that the legal challenge to the will had been officially withdrawn. I am still living in the house in Oakville. I painted the front door a dark green that my grandmother always talked about but never got around to doing. The furnace was, in fact, original, and I have scheduled a replacement for the spring. The property taxes are significant, yes, but I earn a nurse's salary, and I've been managing my own money since I was 19 years old, so I am fine. I kept Brianna's number. I haven't decided what to do with it yet. She reached out once, a short text, nothing that required a response. I read it, and I thought about it for several days, and then I set the phone down and went to make butter tarts using my grandmother's recipe, the one she wrote in her slanted cursive on an index card that I have kept in the recipe box on the counter since October. I don't know what Brianna will do with what happened to her. I don't know if it will change her or just leave a scar over the same person she was before. That's not mine to manage. What I know is this. My grandmother looked at a 9-year-old girl who had lost everything and chose to show up every single day for the next 19 years. She didn't do it because it was convenient. She didn't do it because it was required. She did it because that is what love actually looks like when you take the word out of greeting cards and put it back into real life. Patricia spent 30 years waiting for an inheritance. She was so focused on what she was owed that she never noticed the thing being built right in front of her. She never noticed that Rose had already given it away. Not in the will, not in the legal document, but in the daily, unremarkable, enormously expensive act of showing up. You cannot forge that. You cannot contest it in probate court. You cannot grind it into a powder and dissolve it in chamomile. The only way to receive it is to earn it. Every single day, without asking what it's worth. So I want to know, and I mean this genuinely, I want to read every response. Have you ever been the one who showed up over and over, only to watch someone else try to take what that cost you? Drop it in the comments. Tell me your story. And if this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Karma always finds the address. It just takes its time. People talk about karma like it's something that arrives dramatically. A thunderclap, a moment of visible justice, a scene you could put in a film. In my experience, it's quieter than that. It looks like a woman grinding pills into chamomile while her husband changes channels in the next room. It looks like a daughter snatching a mug across a dinner table because she was raised to believe that wanting something was the same as deserving it. It looks like a plan that took years to construct collapsing inside of 4 minutes because the people who built it forgot one thing. They were not the only ones who had been paying attention. Patricia spent 30 years watching my grandmother build something. She watched the house appreciate. She watched the will get updated. She watched me show up year after year, not because I was calculating a return, but because my grandmother had shown up for me first. And that kind of debt doesn't sit in a spreadsheet. It lives in you. It changes how you move through the world. Patricia saw the same house I saw and thought about what it was worth on the current market. I saw it and thought about the woman who had cut flowers from the backyard garden for every single one of my university convocations. That difference between measuring love and living it is not a small thing. It is, I think, the only thing that actually matters in the end. What I'd come to understand is that intelligence without integrity is just a more sophisticated way to cause harm. Patricia was not a foolish person. She was organized. She was patient. She'd constructed a plan with multiple layers: the legal challenge to exhaust my resources, the forged insurance policy as a backup, and finally the most direct option of all, delivered warm in a ceramic mug. It took real effort, real planning, and it still collapsed completely, not because of luck, but because she had built her entire strategy on the assumption that I was passive, that years of being underestimated had made me small. She didn't understand that being underestimated had made me small. She didn't understand that being underestimated is not the same as being unaware. She didn't understand that the person who has learned to be quiet in a room full of people who dismiss them has also learned to notice everything those people do while they are busy not watching. Resilience is not loudness. It is not the dramatic confrontation or the pointed speech. It is showing up the next day and the day after that, after every dismissal and every act of erasure, and continuing to build something real. My grandmother built something real. I watched her do it for 19 years and I learned what it looked like. That is the inheritance that cannot be forged or contested or dissolved in a drink. I don't know if Brianna will become someone different because of what happened to her. I hope she does. I hope she looks at that hospital ceiling and understands that her mother's entitlement was not love, and that confusing the two had nearly cost her everything. That is a hard lesson to receive. But hard lessons, taken seriously, are the ones that actually change a person. As for me, I painted the front door the dark green my grandmother always wanted. I make her butter tarts on Sunday afternoons. I show up. That is the whole story. That has always been the whole story.